Hello, this is Eric from labofcoding.com. In the last video, I introduced the Django URL template tag, and we used it to create URL for each of our to-dos. In this video, I'm going to pick up from that. I'm going to introduce the Django Forms API. Django has a Forms API, which makes it easy to work with the HTML form in your Django views. So far, we have created two of our URLs. The first one is the homepage URL to list all the to-dos, and the second one was the URL to get the endpoint to get to do with a given ID. So in the next few videos, we'll be looking at creating the endpoint, which will be allowing users to create a new to-do in the database. So before you go through that, we'll need first to talk about the Forms API, which is what we will use in the endpoint, which allows user to create new to-dos. So the Django has a Forms API which serves three main purposes. Let's close that. So the first one is when someone submits data in a form in your Django view, Django does the Forms API helps with three things. First of all, it helps in cleaning and validating the data that the user submits. So Django will clean it and convert it to the appropriate Python data types, and then it will. The second thing, Django helps in generating the form HTML markup. So there is no need for you to write the HTML markup yourself. Django will do that for you. Even though it won't add any styling, you will have to do that yourself. And then Django also, the Forms API helps in receiving and processing the form data that our user or client has submitted. So those are the three main roles of the Django Forms. There are several HTTP methods, some of which include the get, put, delete, post, and patch methods. Even though in our Django project, you'll mainly be working with the get and post methods. These methods are divided into two groups, independent and non-independent methods. The first group, these are methods which can be called severally without different outcomes. That is, even if you call it several times, the outcome will be the same. For example, the get method, when you call the index view, it will return the same result no matter how many times you call it, but that is not the case with, for example, the post method. So it's usually advisable for anything that will change the for any endpoint which will change the state of your server or database, to use an idempotent method, that is either post or patch method. So in this case, the methods which will be changing the state of our database, in this case creating a new to-do, updating a to-do, and deleting a to-do, will be using the post method. And for the others which result in no change, we'll use the get method. So we will process all our form submissions using the post method. So but before we go into the actual view which handles that, we'll first have to work on to give an overview of the Django Forms API. As I've mentioned earlier, the Django Forms API is quite similar to the Models API. So first of all, so to allow users to create a new to-do, we'll have to create a form which will handle that data. And the forms, your forms usually are kept in a file known as forms.py in your application. So let's create that. So in our main app, let's create a file forms.py. So the forms.py is usually a form class which follows the same declarative syntax that the model has, and it has fields which are quite similar. For example, for a model char field, the Django Forms API has a forms.char field which maps to a models.char field. The date field, that's the same. The due field, it has a forms.boolean field, and so forth. So let's drop into our forms.py and create our new to-do form. So let's say from Django import forms. So because this is a to-do form, let's just call it to-do form, and that will inherit from the forms.form class. So if we go to the Django website, let's search for form fields. So Django has an API reference page which lists all the various form fields and the various arguments that they take. For example, each field has a required argument, which by default is set to true. That is, if any field has this field set to true, it is a must that when that form is submitted, it should be there. Otherwise, the form will be considered to be incomplete or invalid. So let's create the form which we'll use to process the to-do data before we save it in our to-do table. So we have in our model field, we have a title, due date, done, and description. So let's have the title. So this one will be models, forms.jar field. Because in our models, our title has a max length of 255, the jar field also accepts an argument of max length. So let's give the same. And we have the description, which is in the models is a text field, but in forms.py we'll still use the char field. So that will be forms.char field. We have no max length there. Then we have the done field, so that will be forms.boolean field. And then we have the due date. So that will be due date. That will be a forms.date field. So when we are submitting data, we will use the form to get that data and validate it before we pass it to our to-do model for saving in the database. So we can drop into the command line and play around with the to-do form. It has several methods which we can play around with before we use it in our view to create the new to-do. But before we do that, if you look at the models.py file, you'll find that the done field has a default value of false, meaning that even if we don't pass it, Django will still use the default value that is provided. So there is no need for us to provide it in the form, so we can drop it from the form class. So now let's drop into the Python shell and create and play around with the Django Forms API. So that will be python manage.py shell. So first, because we have a due date, let's import the datetime module. So that will be from datetime import datetime. So and let's import the form class. So that will be from main.forms import to do form. So the way that you initialize a form, you pass a dictionary data to the form, and then you use that one to validate the form and check if all the data is valid or not. So let's create the data dictionary. So we know we have a title in our form. So let's just call this title 1. We have a description. Let's call this description 1, and we have a due date. Let's pass today's date, so that will be datetime.now. can just say date. Yeah, so I hope the syntax is correct there. So we can initialize our form and pass the data dictionary. So if all the data is valid, Django has a way that you can use to check if it's indeed valid, and if it's not, Django will tell you so. So that method is known as form.isValid, and it returns a boolean which specifies whether all the data that has been submitted to the form is valid or not. So form.isValid is true, meaning that all the data that we have passed initialize the form with is valid. So if after calling this method and all the data is valid, Django will populate a dictionary on the form known as form.cleanData. So this clean data dictionary will have the data that you've submitted properly cleaned and converted to the appropriate Python data types, and you can use that one to even create your to-dos in the database. So that is the clean data, and we can use this one to create the new to-dos. So we can import the to-do model and use that one to create the new to-do. So let's say to-do dot objects dot create. So we can, because this is a dictionary, we can just use keyword and unwrapping to pass them as keyword arguments in the create method. Oops, sorry, that one was not quarks, it was data. Yeah, so that has been valid, and we have created a new to do in the database. We can check that one with, yeah, so the last object that we have created is to do dot object is to do with title 1. So if your form is not valid, Django will complain. The form that is valid will result to false, and Django will populate a dictionary of errors on your form class. So let's change the due date to an invalid date. Let's say this today, a random string. Oops, sorry, supposed to be a bracket there. And then so let's pass this to the form, the data. So if we say form dot is valid, so that our form is not valid, and so if it's not valid, Django will populate a dictionary known as errors, which is a dictionary mapping a field and the errors that it has. So it can have several errors, that's why it's the errors are a list. So in this case, due date, we are told to enter a valid date because the string today is not a valid date. The form instance also has several methods which you can use to get the HTML for that form. So one of these methods is form.asp on each form instance. So this one will print the form as a paragraph, each field as a paragraph. So we have each field as a paragraph, and you can see that Django has given it a label and even the input type for each of those fields, and also you can see that the due date, which had an error, we have an error also given in the HTML that has been printed, and you can use this one to display the error to the user when they're trying to submit an invalid date, for example. And there is another method, form.asTable, which prints each form field as a table row. But remember that it's not wrapped in the table element tags. You will have to do that yourself. So if we go back to the forms.py file, if you look at it closely and you look at the model field closely, you'll find that the code looks a bit similar. It's sort of duplicated. Yeah, it's duplicated because the to do form is mapping on the model to do. So Django has a shortcut and another form class known as model form, which is what you use to create forms that map directly to models, which reduce the code that you write in your form. So the model form, you will give it the model that you want to map to and the fields in that model if you want to map to. So we can change this one to a model form, and then let's remove everything. So the model form has an inner class known as meta. So this is where you specify the options. So in this case, you want to map it to the to-do model. So let's import the model from models, import to-do. And then let's give the fields that we want to map to. If you wanted to map to all the fields, you will just give the string under all, and Django will map all the fields to this form. So our model form will have all those fields. But now we want to map only the title, due date, and description. So we can give that one as a tuple. So we'll have that one, title. Let's have the due date first, and then the description. So let's save that. In this case, our model form will be working similarly to the form class that we had, but this one will be mapping to the models, to the to-do model, and it will also additionally have a save method which you can use to directly save a to-do in your database. So we can close this one, and let's start the Python shell again, and let's import our model form. So from main.forms, import to do form. So let's import the datetime object again. So let's create the data dictionary like we did. For brevity's sake, let's just say T1 there. Description, let's say this is also D1. The due date, let's just say datetime now date. Hope all is well there. Yeah, so let's initialize our to-do form. Let's pass the data. So let's check if the data is still valid with the model form. Yeah, the data is valid. So in this case, a model form, unlike the normal form, the model form additionally has a save method which you can use to save the model that you're mapping to in the database. So if the data is valid, it means we can save it to the database, so using the save method. So that will be form.save, and we have saved the that to do in the database. Yeah, so as you can see, the to do form has simplified our form code, and it has made it a bit easier. So that's it for now. We'll pick it from this in the next video. Thanks for watching.